Yep, it's another self-diagnosis video. I don't have much of an intro. That's what the video is. Let's just get into it. Before we continue, if you like my content and want to support it, please check out my Amazon affiliate links in the description. I also have all my sources linked in the description, and I want to give a massive thank you to anyone who checks out the affiliate links, and let's just get into the video. Self-diagnosis is a pretty contentious topic online, and while many of the arguments made for it are genuine, real issues, it tends to fall into a bit of a false dichotomy where people act as though self-diagnosis is the only solution to the very real issues presented. The most common arguments for self-diagnosis that I've personally encountered are, I can't afford to go to a doctor, or my parents don't believe in psychiatry. Doctors are biased against people of color, women, and LGBT folks. I know myself best. Self-diagnosis leads to a real diagnosis. And people discriminate against autistic people when hiring or immigrating. All of these things, except for the one about hiring with autism because your employer can't access your medical records, HIPAA exists. But the rest are real, genuine issues. But the idea that self-diagnosis is not only a good solution, but the only one, are unfortunately lacking any real support. Before we continue, I think it's important to establish why diagnoses exist, what their purpose is. Then we can determine if self-diagnosis is capable of effectively accomplishing these things. A diagnosis has two main functions: to categorize symptoms for physicians, which helps determine their cause and provide more accurate and effective care, as well as to actually provide more appropriate treatment or accommodation. This can range from treatment to cure a disorder, skills, therapy or medication to manage symptoms, assistive tools such as AAC devices, headphones or hearing aids, wheelchairs or other mobility aids, or accommodations at school or work, as well as to provide evidence of disability to Social Security and other disability services. Essentially, a diagnosis exists to categorize symptoms, which makes it more easy to appropriately manage or treat the condition. So, can self-diagnosis accomplish either of these? When it comes to categorization, the main usage of this is to determine what's causing the symptoms. If someone has multiple conditions, especially those with comorbidity or overlapping symptoms, it's important to know why these symptoms are occurring. For example, borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder both result in symptoms that present as extreme emotions or mood swings. People can have both of these conditions, however, while they can present similarly on the outside, there are things that differ, and their causes and therefore treatment differ as well. The ability to correctly categorize mania and bipolar versus euphoric mood swings and BPD allows the person to receive proper treatment that varies based on the condition. BPD is most commonly treated with DBT therapy, and while medication may be beneficial to some, it's not the primary treatment method. BPD is generally believed to develop as a result of consistent trauma throughout childhood that results in the individual developing specific unhealthy behaviors to keep themselves safe or to cope with the situation. The main goal in BPD treatment, coming from someone who has it, is to unlearn these behaviors and responses and replace them with healthier behaviors. DBT therapy focuses on developing methods for healthy communication, emotion regulation, as well as identifying your emotions, and uses the idea of the emotion mind, rational mind, and wise mind, with the wise mind being the understanding of both of the others simultaneously. This is very helpful in curbing black and white thinking, which is very common in BPD, and understanding conflicting emotions that may be confusing or angering. Bipolar, however, is generally believed to be the result of a chemical imbalance in the brain. While therapy is beneficial for individuals with bipolar to cope with their symptoms, it's not able to get rid of them in the way it is for BPD, and as such, medication is a vital part of managing bipolar disorder. In the case of conditions that are commonly comorbid, a diagnosis allows a physician to make a more educated conclusion on what may be causing symptoms not explained by the original diagnosis. It also allows for a clearer understanding of overlapping symptoms and how to manage them properly. Self-diagnosis comes into a bit of a problem here. While it's obvious that the average person lacks the resources available when attending medical school, such as hands-on experience, professionals to ask questions to or correct misunderstandings, and learning information with the correct context and further explanation, something that is a problem for self-diagnosis to be clear, people generally lack the ability to understand medical jargon and commonly misunderstand either the condition itself or fall victim to confirmation bias. Diagnosis is not just determined by checking off symptoms in the DSM, but through an understanding of the individual's history, the medical context of certain symptoms, and the severity of the symptoms. It's possible for someone to experience all the symptoms of a specific condition, but not receive a diagnosis due to those symptoms being subclinical, essentially lacking a notable effect on the individual's daily life. Doctors do not diagnose themselves due to the immense amount of personal bias when assessing symptoms. Someone without the medical knowledge to diagnose themselves in the first place not only presents the same personal bias as everyone else, but also lacks the education to make a reliable determination. The idea of I know myself best that's often presented when discussing self-diagnosis comes into play here. For some, this is frankly untrue if they really do have a certain diagnosis, particularly those that result in dissociation, psychosis, or identity issues. But even for those who don't fall into that category, they're lacking the medical knowledge and context for those experiences, as well as a disproportionate amount of personal bias to be able to assign a label to said symptoms. Knowing your symptoms is a good thing that can help if you gain access to medical care, but it does not equate to having the knowledge of those symptoms on an academic level. While it is true that doctors misdiagnose things too, and that of course they have bias, since they're human, there's a drastic difference in severity between doctors' personal bias on an experience that they're disconnected from and have an education to manage, and the personal bias of someone actually experiencing it on top of the lack of education to form a conclusion. Aside from this, it's unlikely that someone will be doing in-depth research, which still is not a medical degree, on not only the condition that they expect, but those that have overlapping symptoms. It's honestly unlikely that they'll even know the names of every condition that overlaps. I doubt people self-diagnosing autism are looking into fetal alcohol syndrome, or people self-diagnosing schizophrenia have considered that they have a brain tumor. Sometimes overlapping symptoms can go outside of mental health and also be caused by physical issues. While I'm sure there are self-diagnosers who look outside just one condition, it's often similar conditions such as DID and OSDD, or autism and ADHD. Again, I'll restate that no amount of research will make you qualified to diagnose yourself or mitigate your personal bias, but it's much worse when the research is confined to 2 or 3 conditions, or sometimes, even just the one. Ultimately, self-diagnosis is generally not able to achieve the goal of accurately categorizing symptoms and determining their cause. The personal bias is overwhelming and the lack of education is palpable. Even when self-diagnosis is correct, it's essentially a shot in the dark that landed. And the confirmation bias of not only those who have self-diagnosis confirmed, but those who hear about it from others, further encourages the idea that self-diagnosis is reliable. The people who are wrong slowly fade into the background, and the people who never received psychiatric help but ceased to experience symptoms are ignored. The second purpose of a diagnosis is to receive the appropriate treatment, symptom management, or accommodation. This is, pretty straightforward. Self-diagnosis does not grant you any new resources that simply tracking and being aware of your symptoms does not. You do not gain access to medication, therapy, school or work accommodations, or expensive assistive devices that would be covered through DME insurance with a diagnosis. When it comes to online resources such as books, forums, and articles, these things are just as available when being aware of your symptoms instead of assigning a specific label to them, let alone shouting it all over the internet. The idea that self-diagnosis leads to diagnosis is also frankly unhelpful. While self-awareness of symptoms can actually lead to seeking help, there's no reason that a specific disorder needs to be not only claimed but spread all over the internet. Plenty of people will also become attached to the labels that they've used and either lie or doctor shop in order to receive that specific diagnosis, which can lead to improper treatment or even worsening of symptoms. While the idea that POC and women are less likely to be taken seriously by medical professionals and that medical care is a privilege are undoubtedly true, self-diagnosis does not present a viable solution to these issues. It presents no new resources and can lead to inaccurate understandings of both the conditions themselves and your own personal experiences. So, okay, even if all of that is true, what's the problem? Sure, maybe it doesn't actually help, but it can validate people. Well, for one, validating people on something that's likely a false conclusion is bad. It reinforces the misinformation they've consumed or concocted. However, aside from that, due to the lack of medical knowledge as well as often being incorrect, misinformation is commonly spread by communities that are supportive of self-diagnosis. This mainly comes from 2 places: a misunderstanding or inability to properly read papers and articles on the condition and therefore coming to false conclusions, and not actually having the condition but presenting their experience as a representation of it. A common example of this that's seemingly a result of both of these issues is that of the headspace. Headspaces are a therapy tool used to help people with a multitude of conditions. It's generally considered a mindfulness technique that can help people understand their own emotions or self better. It's something I've used in my own therapy to help me understand issues with identity from my BPD as well as better understand conflicting emotions. However, the term has been misconstrued by a plethora of people who have self-diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, believing it to be a place that alters kind of hang out when not fronting. They'll describe remembering performing certain actions or speaking to other alters in Headspace, certain consistent features such as buildings or plants, and essentially treat it as though it's a literal place in their brain that they go when they're not fronting. This is unsurprisingly not how Headspaces work. They're actively and intentionally thought of with therapeutic intent, not consistent places that happen independently. And aside from this, alters are essentially different memories being compartmentalized, and as such creating different experiences and personalities, likes and dislikes, etc. They do not exist as a literal separate person in your head who continues to fully function in your brain when they're not fronting. This can not only lead to others falsely self-diagnosing as a result of this misinformation, but can affect the way that people understand stigmatized disorders and therefore treat those who are genuinely diagnosed with the condition and as such do not claim these experiences as their own. It also results in people who falsely claim to have the disorder, often including that misinformation, to insert themselves into community support groups as well as activism or awareness spaces. This drowns out discussion and advice from people who genuinely have the condition, often providing bad advice or drastic misunderstandings of others' experiences on the basis of both their lack of knowledge and lack of experiences. It can also lead to public misinformation. Many people who self-diagnose create accounts to quote-unquote spread awareness or educate people on their disorder, but end up further spreading that misinformation, speaking over people with the condition, demonizing those who actually have the condition as a result of their differing experiences from the multitude of self-diagnosers, and resulting from all that, isolating diagnosed people from those like them and misinforming potential loved ones of people who may know someone who truly has that condition, and then affecting how they treat that person. Self-diagnosis not only does not serve the function of a diagnosis, but can be harmful to those with a diagnosis. Being aware and mindful of your mental health is a good thing, but there's no reason that needs to include self-diagnosis, let alone public self-diagnosis. That's all I got for today. Thanks for watching, guys. Ha det.
I stare at the populace in prayer.